These are the Civivi Baby Banter, which is a great small little knife in a lot of ways, but one that does end up feeling limited by its price point. And I'll go into a little bit why. This knife is the newest knife. Well, it's not the newest. Now it's the second newest. But it's one of the newer knives in the Banter series. The Banter was a design by Ben Peterson of Blade HQ fame, who now is what seems to be a full-time knife designer with a bunch of different designs, with working with Kaiser under his own brand name, working with Civivi on the Banter series, and now working with MKM Knives in Maniago on a couple designs for them. The Yipper, I think, is the first one there. And I know there's one other that I'm forgetting in his portfolio, but he's got quite a number of designs. This is meant to be a very small, affordable, everyday carry, and it does a lot of things well, but it does struggle in a couple of areas. This is ClarkeTheKnife. My goal with my reviews is to give you a single video that lets you know everything you need to make an informed purchase decision and to really know whether this is the right knife for you or not. I'm going to try to do that as quickly as we can while going into as much detail as is necessary. Go through 5 sections in my review. Start with overall specifications, size, weight, length, price, things like that. Then we talk about what's good. Then we talk about what I like less. We'll talk about fit, finish, and value in detail, and then conclude with some overall thoughts. We're going to focus this review on the drop point version here. We'll talk about the differences with the Wharncliffe version in the end, which are meaningful in this area, but also not as meaningful as you might think. So, Baby Banter here is a tiny knife. This is a 5.46 inch knife with a 2.34 inch blade. This is 90,000 thick, which is quite thin. And the blade on most of these is Nitro V in the tiny, tiny little type that they choose there. This is a 2-ounce knife, so very light and less than 1 ounce an inch. It is made by Civivi, so that's now Wii's mid-tier line, with Wii knives being their high-end, Sencut being their cheapest, and Civivi tending to sit in that $50 to $100 range. So even within Civivi, this is at the lower end of Civivi's price range. About $60 for this. About $60 for this knife in most configurations. Do some size comparisons quick. The most obvious size comparison here is your full-size Banter, and you'll see this is very significantly smaller than the Banter. You can see there's still a lot of the same design cues there. You can still see there's the same relatively neutral drop point blade here. There's still the same relatively neutral handle design, but they added a front finger choil. They made the curves a little bit more exaggerated, but it's still very much a Banter compared to our Spyderco Para 3. And you can see this is significantly smaller than the Para 3. Where the Para 3 is a small knife that can do bigger stuff on occasion, and that's sort of its design philosophy, this is just a straight up small knife. Even if we just compare sharpened blade length, this has less sharpened blade length than the Para 3, which is already a knife without much sharpened blade length. It is much smaller in the pocket. It is much, much lighter. I mean, this is really a true 5th pocket knife. But just to give you a sense of how much smaller it is, and if we even compare it to the Delica, you'll see it is quite a bit smaller than the Delica, where most of the Civivi Baby Banter can fit just in the Delica's handle. The one knife that most people are going to know about that's about the same size is your Dragonfly. This is very similar in size to the Spyderco Dragonfly, and similar to the Dragonfly, uses that front choil to get more grip area out of what is a very small knife. We're going to talk about these two in our summary at the end, but that's really your comparison. And the thing to emphasize is this is a small knife. A lot of folks, even folks that are just getting into knives, that think they know about small knives, there's really 2 categories of small knives. There are small knives like the Para 3, like the Delica, which are usually in that 2.5 to 3 inch range, which, if they're properly designed, can flex their way up to bigger knife chores. You can get a full 4-finger grip on them usually, unless you've got very large hands. You can design small knives that they can do a lot of the things that bigger knives can do, just in a smaller package and with a couple compromises here and there. When you get sub 2.5 inches into a small knife, you are talking about a knife that is meant to be very carryable, to be almost invisible in the pocket, but that has some necessary compromises just to get something this small. There are a lot of tasks that just a knife this small is not going to be good at doing, no matter how well it is designed. And so we're going to assess the Civivi Baby Banter primarily based on that context and the fact that this knife is not trying to do everything, but what it is trying to do is be super carryable, super inoffensive, just a light, easy, relatively affordable carry that should be great for EDC and your everyday sort of home and office tasks based on what this is. So we're going to talk about it in that context. So first, what do I like? There are a few things really to like here. The first one, and keep in mind, we're talking about a $60 knife for all of this. So we're talking about something that is legitimately affordable. The action, as Civivi tends to do, is really, really good for a $60 knife. I happen to think that of all the Chinese makers, we does the best job with in the about $200 price range. I like their stuff better than Riot in that price range. They tend to have really snappy detents, really smooth actions, a really tight level of fit and finish, and they're doing the same thing with Civivi here. And you've got a very accessible liner lock here. You've got a nicely ground and nicely cut blade, and you've got, even though it's a tiny blade, a very smooth opening and closing action on bearings. With a decently stiff detent, that gives you a very crisp and snappy open. This is also, by the way, an excellent thumb stud here. Very simple, very similar, maybe even identical. Yeah, it looks identical to me to the design on the original Banter, which I also really liked. It's oriented very nicely relative to the pivot, where most of your force is directly perpendicular to that pivot, which lets them have a decently strong detent on there with a nice crisp break. It just fires out, and it's not really drop shutty. It'd be hard to make any blade this small drop shutty unless you're really going into like custom level tolerances, but it drops nice and smoothly, or it closes nice and smoothly. You can slow roll it if you want to, but that detent is really just nice and crisp. It is a very impressive action at the price point, and even folks who are relative action snobs are going to find this at least to be a satisfying detent. Again, especially at the $60 price point. And that's really nice to see. That's really nice to feel. It's kind of impressive. You know, if you look at makers other than Civivi, makers less accomplished than Civivi, when you get at this level, you start to really feel that things are compromised. You start to see liners that don't sit flush. You start to see actions that feel sludgy even after they're broken in. Stuff just doesn't quite fit right. That's never really a problem with Civivi. They nail the basics. And the action here, which is one of those basics, is really good. Second thing I like is that they've made some really smart changes to the Banter's design. Again, I'll pull out my Banter here when they shrunk it. So with the Banter, you know, a couple of things that Ben was supposedly designing for. He wanted a very versatile EDC blade shape. He's got the specific design constraint that he likes to be able to bring the tip of his finger up to the tip of the blade here. So you can do those drag cuts. You can use it kind of like a Wharncliffe with lots of control over that edge without having to make it a Warney. You can obviously still do that even better here on this one. And then you also want an inoffensive blade shape. One of the really nice things about the original Banter and this one here, which if anything drops a little bit lower from the top, is this bulbous blade shape. I mean, it looks like a hippo or something like that. There is nobody that is going to be scared by this blade, which makes it very office friendly, very lunchroom friendly, very knives around knife people friendly, or non-knife people friendly. But what they did most importantly was they added this choil, and then they also steepened this swoop just a little bit. This choil is a really nice design for the same reason it is in the Dragonfly. What it does is it allows you, now you're giving up some sharpened blade length obviously, but it's a tiny blade either way. Whether this is, 1.8 inches of blade length or 2 inches of blade length doesn't make that much of a difference. But with this choil, first off, you're getting right up next to that blade edge, so you have tons of control over it. And you can actually get a 4-finger grip on this tiny little knife, unless you have really large hands. And because they curved this down a little further, it's actually decently secure ergonomically. This curve towards your pinky gives these 3 fingers lots of space to sit in there. You combine it with that choil, you combine it with ramping back on this jimping if you want to. This feels a little cramped. Or just sitting nicely up on the top of the blade. You've got lots of control over this knife here. It feels very secure in the hand. Now, it's still a neutral slab-sided handle. Would I want to break down a ton of boxes with this thing? No. It would start to feel uncomfortable. It would still roll in the hand, things like that. But would I want to drive this through drywall? No. That's not what this knife is meant for. For those light-duty tasks, this grip is great for breaking down a couple boxes, for cutting through a few envelopes, even for doing, light around the housework, stripping up a couple wires or cutting through some twine or, even breaking through a little piece of drywall if you want to cut something out. This pinch grip works really nicely on this because you've got a nice point here to anchor your middle finger. You can even go up into the choil if you really want to pinch up, and that gives you lots of delicate and fine control. It's a really nice design that I believe takes a lot of inspiration from the Dragonfly, with a relatively neutral back, obviously more neutral in the Baby Banter than the Dragonfly, and using that choil and a gradual single swoop there to maximize the space that your hands can use for a very tiny little blade. And it works here for the exact same reasons it works for the Dragonfly. This ends up being about as comfortable and useful as a knife this small can possibly be as a result. It's great. And then the other thing that is nice about it is just the overall simplicity of the design and just how clearly the Banter series has already established a design philosophy. Like, between the squared off handles and the way that they square them off, between the simple curve, between that particular blade shape he uses, it's kind of cool that across 3 Banter designs, men at all have managed to make a really distinctive and consistent design philosophy. Like, that these are a Banter. You know what you're going to get from a Banter. You know where they're going to be good. You know where they're going to maybe struggle a little bit. But it's just nice to have that level of familiarity, to have that level of consistency. Sort of the design nerd in me really appreciates that, and appreciates that they took the exercise of putting real improvements into the Baby Banter here to adapt to that smaller size while still staying true to that Banter design language. So this ends up being a very simple, useful little knife that is great for all your little knife tasks. Breaking open a package, cutting through tape, cutting through some twine, cutting some paper. This blade, because you can get right up to that tip, is great for your drag cuts, your poke cuts, things like that. Now, I won't get into, I'm about to get into the stuff I don't like, but the fact is, for most of the tasks that you would want to use a 2.34-inch blade for, this does a pretty good job. And the fact is, the last thing that I need to talk about that's a positive, because I really shouldn't overlook this, is that this just is a very, very small knife. And as a result, it is super carryable, about as carryable as any knife could be. Again, let's show this. In the pocket, it's actually even smaller than the Dragonfly. It's not quite as light. The Dragonflies are a little bit lighter. But this thing, again, let me just bring out the Para 2 and show how much smaller this is in the pocket, or Para 3, than the Para 3. Like, if you look at actual volume in the pocket, it's like half the size of the Para 3, which is already what most people consider a smaller knife. This is a true fifth pocket knife in a way that a lot of things that call themselves fifth pocket knives really aren't. It has to do with the fact that that blade mostly folds up into the handle. It has to do with the fact that this handle is squared off, so the whole thing becomes just a nice compact little block. It has to do with the fact that this simple bent over clip is deep carry and fits everything very nicely into that pocket. It has to do with the fact that it's not that thick, that you've got a thin blade stock and you've got relatively thin scales here. This is a knife that, even though it does have some compromises on performance, some of which are inherent to the blade size and some of which are specific to this knife, you can almost bear with a lot of those compromises because it is just so darn small. And when you get this ergonomic performance alongside that size, it's just a really pleasant knife to carry, and it's a pleasant knife to have on you, and it is really, I mean, I'm never a big fan of the idea of carrying two knives. I feel like if you have to carry two knives, then you either don't understand what you're going to be doing that day or you own the wrong knives. Like, you should just be able to have, I mean, it's 2024. There are a million pocket knife designs out there. You should be able to find a single knife that can do everything you need that day. And the only exception I can think of that is if you want one folder and a fixed blade, if you, like, live on a ranch. But this knife is so small that I can almost entertain the idea of carrying two knives, because if you want to carry your XM18 or something like that, you want something big and beastly because it's fun, or because you're one of the 1% of people that actually need that. This thing is so small that you can throw it in a bag, you can throw it in a pocket, you can throw it wherever, and you're literally not going to notice it. It's going to be one of the smallest objects you have in that bag. Whatever you use as a wallet or a credit card holder probably takes up more space in your pocket than this does. That's really cool. Now, compromises. The stuff this doesn't do well. First off, this blade, as much as I love the idea of the design, I haven't loved it quite as much in practice. One of the reasons is design. One of the reasons is execution. Design-wise, this is absolutely a blade that works well for those lightweight EDC tasks. Again, in particular because it's so short. You can drag it through things. You can pull it through things. I do wish they brought this tip up a little further and brought a little bit more belly in this version. Kind of like they did in the original Banter, where the tip is a little bit higher. And the reason for that is the few times that I did try to push this through longer cuts, you get the sort of issue you tend to get with sheep's foot like this, because this honestly, this is by this point more of a sheep's foot than a drop point, which is it is a little harder to keep this in the cut. As you drag it, as you pull it through, as your wrist rotates, it wants to pull out of the cut, and then you've got to re-engage that cut. I think if they raise this tip a little bit further, it would be slightly more versatile, and because it's so small, you would still be able to access that tip for those draw cuts, pull cuts, utility cuts, things like that. So I did find this a little bit frustrating, and I mean, you're always going to use it up in that choil, but the one or two times I tried to use it outside this choil, I mean, the cut would fall into the choil all the time. It's really only useful in this single grip here. The second part, that's the one part that's legitimately a little disappointing, and it's also the one place that you feel the price point being a negative. This grind is not great. This knife starts from 90 thousandths blade stock. That is the same as your TRM, Neutron, and Atom. But this knife comes to you, and you can see even when you look at it behind the edge there, this is not nearly as thin behind the edge as it could be. And if you're used to using knives like your Dragonfly, or like your TRM Neutron, or even like your Delica, other knives that have this same stock thickness, it's not going to cut anywhere near as well as them. Every single time I tried to use this to actually cut stuff, that wasn't a very light duty task. I was more than a little disappointed by the performance that I got out of this edge and out of this blade. It just felt like it was dragging through stuff more than slicing, more than cutting, and it was just more work to cut everything than it should have been. That unfortunately makes the limitations inherent to a handle this small all the more serious because, while this is a comfortable knife for a 2.34-inch blade, it's still not a comfortable knife. Like, it's still blocky, it's still squared off. You still have, you're cramping your fingers together a little bit here, and it's still not much in your hand. When you start to push this harder, you feel that there's not that much to grip on, and it just starts to be a little bit less comfortable. If this was a super slicey blade, and again, that's part of the reason that the Dragonfly works so well. This is a supremely slicey blade, so you never end up having to push it hard because there's just not that much resistance when it's slicing through everything with no effort. This one, you have to push it harder, and so it feels a little clunkier, it feels a little less comfortable, just because that blade grind is not really doing it any favors, and it is, again, the one place that it does feel like that $60 price point has compromised things a little bit, where they just didn't go maybe as aggressive as they could have. The factory edge certainly is not fantastic, but also I'm just not as inclined on a knife of this size and at this price point to put as much work laying back that edge as maybe I would have on some other knives. It's just not really worth the time or effort. Could I get this thing to be a great slicer with some more effort on the sharpener? Probably. Am I really inclined to do that? Probably not. And frankly, the target audience for this at $60, you have to assume that the vast majority of people that are buying a baby Banter are going to have neither the interest nor the capability to sharpen their knives themselves, or to sharpen their knives effectively themselves. If they're going to do it, they're going to do it with, your basic work sharp or something like that, or one of the pull-through sharpeners. And so it's just that lack of performance out of the box is a bit more of an issue. Now, one thing I will say, I have no issue whatsoever with Nitro V on this. In fact, I love the choice of Nitro V. Nitro V is, I would say, my outright favorite budget steel. It's basically, I've heard it described as super D2. It's D2 that's a little more corrosion resistant. I believe it's a powder metallurgy steel. And it's nice, especially on thin blades like this, because it is a fairly tough steel. I don't have my steel charts with me right now, but it is a fairly tough steel. It's middle of the road in edge retention, but frankly, you're not going to be pushing this through that much material all that often. It's going to dull that edge. And the toughness is just nice because it does let you keep that blade stock super thin. And it's also more corrosion resistant than D2. Given the other steels that are price competitive to Nitro V, I do really like the choice of Nitro V here. I don't think you're getting that much of a performance drop-off compared to if they used S35VN or something like that, or even S30V on this. I think you're getting similar performance for most of the stuff you would use this for. So my issue is not with the blade steel, it's really more with the grind. That brings us to fit, finish, and value. Again, fit and finish, with the exception of that grind, is really good for 60 bucks. Or to put it another way, this Banter here is twice the price, and it's only in the close details that I really see why this one is more expensive. Your blade grind visually is quite nice. Your choil, your plunge is a little sketchy. It's a little squared off. There's a little bit of just weirdness with how it comes out of that flat there, but it's fine. Your edge looks nice. It just doesn't cut all that well. I do really like the acid wash finish they put on this blade. It also happens to hide wear very nicely, so it's great on a useful little knife like this. Thumb studs, as I mentioned, are fantastic. The jimping is very square, but it's aesthetically nice and useful enough. It's not actually super sharp. The acid wash or stone washing process rounded a lot of the edges, but it's fine. This jimping down here is more ornamental than useful. The liner lock disengages nicely. I already mentioned the action is fantastic and everything is square. There's no play. Liner lock access is very good. You can access it through this whole swoop here. There's plenty of space to get in your thumb. And the finish that they did on this G10 is nice. There's a nice chamfer the whole way around, which is actually smooth out. It looks kind of cool. I really like this color of red. And there's just a tiny bit of texture on this face. It's a very light peel plot. It is a lighter peel ply than the Banter. If you put these textures next to each other, there's a bit more tooth to the Banter than the baby Banter. And it's just, everything is nicely finished. Everything is flush. All the screws are flush. Your standoffs here are nicely finished and are nicely flush. Just, there's really nothing to complain about. It's a very simple design. And you do see, I mean, everything isn't just quite as tight, especially it's the blade that you really see more why this is a $60 knife, but I got nothing to complain about at the price. A brief digression to talk about which of these two versions you should get if you're interested in this knife. I actually prefer this drop point version over the Warney. I really like the Warney handle. Their choice to use this burlap micarta, and honestly, getting a nice burlap micarta like this with micro milling texture on there, you can see those little lines in the light. It does make it significantly nicer in the hand. This one is much more comfortable in the hand than the drop point version here. In fact, I'm sort of going, as I talk through, I'm sort of going against my initial conclusion, because this one is contoured where the other one is flat. This is a very nice material. I don't love the all black finish on this one. Now, with a Warney on a blade this small, there's positives and negatives. The positive is a Warney on a blade this small kind of overcomes the fatness of this grind, and it kind of works like a claw. Because especially for drag cuts and utility cuts and stuff like that, when you're just dragging this tip, which gets pretty keen, when you're dragging this tip through stuff, you've got so much control over that tip, especially when you get in this pinch grip, that it doesn't matter that it's not cutting quite as cleanly. You can still just pull it through stuff and finish those cuts. The problem is this thing is basically just a box cutter. When you put it in this Warney shape, they smartly angled the Wharncliffe up a little bit, which does make it a little bit more versatile. You don't have to cant your hand back quite as much to do those other sorts of cuts. These Wharncliffes, they're tilted up, have become more popular, and for good reason. They're very nice, versatile blade shapes. If all you're going to use this baby Banter for is those utility cuts, box cutting, paper cutting, tape cutting, a little bit of twine, things like that, honestly, get the Warney. This handle is better. It's more comfortable. The contouring really goes a long way. It's not the material, though the material is very pretty, very nice. It's that if they contoured these G10 scales the same way as this and still, basically they probably are only doing it because if they contoured this G10, it would end up smooth and it would be slippery. Whereas with micarta, they can throw the micro milling texture on there and use the inherent grippiness of micarta to still have some texture on there. This, they've got to keep it flat to get the peel ply texture on there. That's why I'm guessing they're doing that, because these are about the same price point. This ends up being a much better box cutter, paper cutter, tape cutter. So if what you want is a nice, tiny little pocketable box cutter, basically, a little foldable X-Acto knife, this one's pretty cool, and it'll work really well. And the fact that that blade is a little thick won't hurt it quite as much as it hurts this one. The problem is, a tiny little Wharncliffe like this, like even breaking down a single box is a pain in the ass, because this is going to fall out of the cut over and over and over again. It's just frustrating to use. So this is better at that very specific sort of task while being even worse than this one at other tasks, to the point that it's almost like don't bother. So this is a more versatile blade shape. This one is better at most of the tasks you're honestly probably going to be using this for. So based on that, and really based on whether you're looking to get this as a secondary knife that you're always going to carry with another knife, in which case this one works really well if your other knife is a drop point or a clip point or something like that. Or if you're, whether it's because of where you live or because of the sort of things you carry, you want to carry this as the only knife you've got, I would say this one, the drop point version, because frankly, since you can get up to this tip so easily, you've got enough control over the tip to make those drag cuts, pull cuts, things like that just as well with this, while being a more versatile blade shape. So that's what I would say between the two. Which brings me to final conclusions. And this, maybe more than just about any other knife I've reviewed, is a knife that is that I'm reviewing particularly in the context of other things that are available, and in this case, one other thing that is available. and that's your Dragonfly. The Dragonfly is your de facto small knife that feels like a slightly bigger knife than it is. And the problem is, when you compare to the Dragonfly here, it really puts all of the limitations of the Baby Banter in a pretty stark light, especially the limitations related to the price point, because the Dragonfly is not that much more expensive, at least if you get it in a comparable steel. Because, VG10, about the same ballpark as your Nitro V here in terms of price. If you can also get Dragonflies in significantly superior steels like K390 if you want to. The Civivi Baby Banter is small in the pocket. It's even smaller in the pocket than the Dragonfly, but it's also a little bit heavier. The Civivi Baby Banter has good ergos, but they're not even quite as good as the Dragonfly. And most importantly, this blade is fine for your EDC tasks, but the fact that it's not really that sharp does start to hold it back when you compare it to the Dragonfly, which behind the edge is one of Spyderco's sharpest knives, and Spyderco's got a lot of very, very sharp knives. When I go from using a Dragonfly, which is a shockingly capable tiny knife, to using a Baby Banter, it feels super limited, and this just feels like a tiny knife, and it feels like it's a more compromised knife. It's less pleasant to use than the Dragonfly, mostly just because it's less sharp, it's less acute, you have a little bit less control over that blade, and so the ergonomic limitations of a small knife become all the more important. Looked at it by itself, if for some reason the Dragonfly isn't an option for you, you're not going to be unhappy with the Baby Banter. It will be fine, but it's not going to impress you. It's going to be a basic tool that will do the job. But nobody's going to grab your Baby Banter and use it and say, wow, that's sharp. Or use it and say, like, wow, that feels really good in the hand. It's not great at anything. It's better than you would expect for a knife this small, but it's not great at anything. If the Dragonfly didn't exist, that would be fine, because that still makes it one of the better tiny knives on the market, especially given the fit and finish that Civivi is bringing at a $60 price point. And if you really like this design, and there's parts that you like, whether it's the thumb stud action, or you just want a faster action, you don't want a backlock, or you like the way that Ben's knives look and feel, you're not going to be unhappy with this. But it's hard for me to recommend the Baby Banter in a world where the Dragonfly exists. Because while the Baby Banter is good at a lot of things, the Dragonfly is like $10 more in VG10, and it is better than the Baby Banter at every single thing that the Baby Banter is good at. And so there's no person I can think of, again, unless you really like this design, that will be better suited getting a Baby Banter than getting a Dragonfly. Again, unless you really like the design, you want a bearings action, or there's something that you don't like about the Dragonfly. And so that's sort of where I land with the Baby Banter. It's a cool knife. I'm glad it exists. It's got a lot of smart design choices. There's nothing wrong with this knife. And I would be interested to see if there was a Wii version of this at like $100. If they could get that grind a little bit more acute, get it a little bit sharper, and really make this design sing. As it stands, it's fine. It's decent, and if you want a tiny knife, you're not going to be unhappy with it. But I also don't think it's necessarily going to be the best choice for you. Hopefully you found this helpful. Hopefully it was a good use of your time. Let me know if you've got any thoughts, questions, or any other knives you'd like me to review down there in the comments. I love to get comments from viewers. If there's any knives you want me to review, I am buying and selling all these knives myself right now. None of this is sponsored at the moment. And so I will try to get my hands on knives if folks want to, but that's going to be dependent on budget and availability. But please throw suggestions my way if you would like. I'm going to keep the reviews coming as long as I've got more knives to review. And yeah, hope this was a good use of your time. Hope you found it helpful. Comment, subscribe, like if you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again soon.